All right. Well, good morning, everyone. A nice small group today. So we're going to finish off this chapter today. So we don't have too many slides, which is nice. It's kind of nice in these chapters where there's a lot of information being thrown at you, where we can kind of take our time walking through it. But we're going to wrap up chapter, I think this is 5 today, and then that sets us up really nicely for chapter 6 next week. And I believe I commented on the fact that chapter 6 is also nice and short in length, so about the same number of slides, which means a nice even split yet again. So something to look forward to. But we had wrapped up just talking about different broad categories of drugs, and we had been talking about depressants versus stimulants. We also talked about opioids, and now we're going to move into talking about psychedelic drugs. And so, psychedelic drugs are specifically made up of compounds that cause perceptual distortions in the user. So, they are sort of associated with hallucinations, but it isn't necessarily full blown hallucinations. It isn't necessarily seeing things that aren't there. It's more of that distorted perception where you see things or hear things just a little bit differently from how they actually are. So these are believed to expand your senses and were highly favored for their ability to increase insight, making people sort of more aware of other things. Um, and that's why that hallucinogenic isn't necessarily the whole picture. So we're going with the term psychedelic, though you will see some texts that still use hallucinogenics, and that's fine too. Um, Right. So when these are typically chosen to be used, it's not so much their feeling good effects. So other types of drugs, we focused on those rewarding effects, the benefits, and the sort of improved feelings that come from taking them. With these psychedelic drugs, it focuses more on that alteration of consciousness than on any rewarding effects. And there are some legal psychedelic drugs, specifically in association with certain religious ceremonies, um, but when we're looking at most of these, we can break them down into these four categories. We have serotonergic, cater, clomaneric. Oh my goodness. I should have figured out how to pronounce these last night. And then NDMA receptor agonists. And then we can mention designer drugs very briefly. The textbook goes into a ton of detail on how each of these work, but I'm just going to get us to hit some of those high points. So our serotonergic are the ones that stimulate our serotonin receptors. So that's where we get sensory distortions. We start seeing more intense shapes and colors, more leaning into that hallucinogenic side of things. And that's because it's interfering with serotonin receptors. And so one of the most widely known ones of these would be LSD. So that was popularized in the 60s and was really common, especially by a lot of early psychologists. We could also have some of the psilocybin derived, the mushroom varieties would fall under this category as well. We can also look at the one that I cannot for the life of me pronounce. And this is when they're specifically focusing on our catechloral catechloramine. There we go, catechloramine neurotransmitters. And that's a category that we very rarely talk about in specifics, which is why I'm struggling so hard with that one today. But that broad category includes some things that we're very familiar with, things like norepinephrine, epinephrine, and dopamine. So all of those fall under that category. So this isn't targeting serotonin, this is targeting things like dopamine, epinephrine, and norepinephrine. And so here we end up with a combination of both some psychedelic like effects, but also some amphetamine like effects. So more of that stimulating effect. And so for our examples for this one, we have mescaline, ecstasy, Molly, all of those would fall under this. MDMA would come into this area. And some of them are sort of more on the hyperactivity side of things, some are more on the hallucinogenic side of things, but this one is categorized separately from the serotonergic because it's not specifically targeting serotonin. And there are some drugs that kind of walk a fine line between these groups, but as you've probably figured out from my style of questioning, I tend to ask you a lot less about which category does this particular drug fall into, and I would ask more about the fact that this category of drugs, how does it act? So if we were talking about the serotonergic ones, they're acting on those serotonin receptors. So that would be a better way to focus in on those. Our NDMA receptor agonists are ones that inhibit our NMDA glutamate receptors. So we don't really have to know the full name of it. We're just talking about a specific type of glutamate receptor, and that's all that matters for us. These were originally developed as an attempt to produce safer anesthetics for surgery, but they ended up producing a lot of hallucinations and a lot of symptoms that actually ended up overlapping really heavily with schizophrenia. And this is one of those things where people accidentally stumbled into something and it created a theory for how they think schizophrenia might be driven. And so the current leading theory for some kinds of schizophrenia, at least, is that it's driven by some kind of error at this NMDA receptor. So it was one of those cases where we kind of accidentally found something that helped us explain something else, which is kind of interesting. Another one of the downsides with this, and goes along with sort of symptoms of schizophrenia, is that feeling of disassociating, so disconnected from your body, as well as hallucinations, which would be why they kind of fell out of favor. And the last category are designer drugs, and this is one where the text doesn't give us a lot of detail, and that's because this is a category that evolves very rapidly. So what happens is that chemists are designing drugs that have similar functions or similar structures to stuff that's already known, but they can kind of play around with the structures, they can change the shape, they can change the action to make them more or less effective. It's also a way for them to get around laws and regulations because it could be advertised as a fertilizer and not fit for human consumption, but it is actually then used for recreation. So there's a lot of ways that that field has circumvented laws and regulations, but it is a very rapidly changing category, and it ends up causing a lot of problems because this is typically run trying to be on the illegal side of things, trying not to draw attention of the law. There's a lot less, say, quality assurance and control that you might get with legal drugs or things that can be used for legitimate purposes. So that's sufficient on our psychedelics. We can talk very, very briefly about marijuana, which we've done a little bit previously. I think I mentioned the fact that marijuana is in one of its own categories. So I've seen some texts that categorize it as a psychedelic because there are mild adjustments of perception. I've seen some group it in with depressants, I believe, just because it's that relaxing, calming sensation. Or like this textbook where it's considered its own sort of separate standalone thing. So depending on your source, you might group it differently. But when we're focusing on marijuana, we're typically looking at dried and crushed leaves and flowers of cannabis sativa. And there are different aspects of the plant that have different effects. Usually when we're looking at sort of the things that might make it qualified as a hallucinogenic would be THC. And again, there's a whole long chemical name for that, but we can stick with THC. And the effects of that would be things like impaired cognition, those distortions of our time and perception, issues with memory and recall, so inability to form some memories and inability to recall some memories, as well as impaired movement and motor coordination. And this all happens because we have cannabinoid receptors in our brain. So we have naturally occurring receptors that react with these sort of molecules released by the cannabis sativa. And so when it binds to different parts of our brain, all throughout our brain, it can interfere with other systems. So that's how we can have issues with things that might be sort of prefrontal cortex related, like decision making and putting together information. But we also have issues with things like coordination and balance, which would be from our occipital lobe or from our cerebellum, sorry. So different parts of the brain all have these receptors, so it has lots of different effects in lots of different places. Um, and there's a whole lot of discussion in the text. They focus on the fact that in the US, it's still illegal in many states. Um, of course, it's a lot harder to find Canadian specific textbooks, and most of them are still a little bit outdated and don't reflect the fact that it has been legalized. But there is sort of this growing sense of it becoming more accepted, especially with more states having it legalized and with Canada having it legalized. They're even finding that there's a lot more support. So the text talked about a particular study looking at how many adults would support legalization in states that hadn't yet legalized it. And they almost doubled the approval in the span of a decade. So it's on the rise, possibly to do with the fact that there's a lot more research nowadays. So we have a better understanding of exactly what's going on. There have been a lot of studies showing benefits. So things like pain management, helping with anxiety, sleep problems, and all sorts of things. And we have ways of separating the THC from other functional components, so it doesn't always have to come with those hallucinogenic and perception altering side effects. So this is one of those things that in the next couple of years, our texts are going to start showing a lot more information because there is a ton of research just absolutely blowing up in this field. So it'll be really interesting to see how that progresses. All right, so that is sufficient talk about different categories and different types of drugs. What we're going to do is move into a more specific conversation about addiction and some of the pathways that might be involved in that. So we've kind of mentioned the original idea that addiction was based on that reward, the pleasurable effects that come from taking drugs. And this is more of a mis oh, there's a word for it, a misconception. There we go. And it's something that we sort of assume that it's due to those good feelings, but more and more research has found that while reward and positive effects can end up establishing a habit, it isn't necessarily the driving factor that maintains that habit. So, though addiction can be created through our reward centers, that isn't necessarily how it's maintained. And so when we talk about reward, for this class in particular, we're going to be talking about the positive effect of an object or condition that it has on the user. So if you use a substance and it makes you feel good, that will be rewarding. And when we're talking about reward, we're usually looking at our mesolimbic pathway. So this is our reward circuit. And I'm actually going to hop back and forth between the text and this diagram here. So we have this mesolimbic pathway that's going from here over to the nucleus accumbens, down to the amygdala, interacting with the hippocampus, all of these different areas. So we have lots of different connections. So the mesolimbic would just be sort of this one here, going from that VTA to the nucleus accumbens. The VTA is just the ventral tegmental area. We don't really care about the full name. VTA is perfectly sufficient. But so that mesolimbic pathway would be just this teeny little place. And then going to the mesocortical pathway would be up into our frontal cortex. So if we think about this, the mesolimbic pathway stays in our limbic system, sort of in that center part of the brain, and the mesocortical pathway ends up connecting it to our prefrontal cortex. So the names kind of hint at which pieces we're looking at. Um, all right, Let me make sure I say everything I wanted to say about this area here. So we mentioned the fact that, okay, so reward is good at establishing those behaviors. So it makes us want to be doing the behavior that makes us feel good. Coming from a background where I know a lot about learning behaviors and how we acquire habits and how we form different behaviors and ways of doing things, focusing on, say, positive reinforcement, things that make us feel good or things that are rewarding, makes our behaviors a lot more likely to occur. What this pathway ends up going on to show us is that, yes, we have that positive reinforcement establishing this relationship, but once it's been established, we start making sort of connections to those other part of the brain. And all addictive drugs end up targeting this mesolimbic dopamine system specifically. So if we remember, dopamine is associated with feeling good, especially in the areas that we're caring about here. So stimulating that part of the brain would produce more of that feel good chemical, which makes us more likely to do that behavior again. All right. So we already pointed out the pathway using the image, so that is fine. Um, the text goes into a lot more descriptive points on how this specifically connects, and they go into the specifics of exactly what's going on, sort of at the level of the neurotransmitters. I'm going to choose to focus on a little bit of a higher level view of this. So we're going to focus on the fact that when addiction is occurring within this pathway, we have that increased production of dopamine, but we also have sort of changes of the rest of our brain as well. So we have increased responding in the pathway that's associated directly with drugs and that specific dopamine release, but we also have reduced responding to dopamine in other parts of the brain. So this is how we run into this issue where individuals will start using drugs. The drugs themselves make them feel good. They then just start developing a tolerance where they're reducing their sensitivity to dopamine in other places. And eventually, the taking the drug itself doesn't even feel good, but even worse, other aspects of their life, other things that used to bring them pleasure no longer do, which makes what little dopamine they can then get from drug use a lot more appealing because nothing else even comes close. So it's kind of this spiraling cycle. And the more you look at the system and how it's set up, the more it seems like it's set up almost perfectly to trap people in that cycle, which is why it's so hard to break free. And we know a lot of the functioning of this pathway from doing some experiments, especially in lab rats, where you can actually stimulate different parts of this pathway. So if we go back again to our visual here, if you stimulate that VTA, which is that starting point of this whole pathway, you start or you trigger that production of extra dopamine. And because you're directly stimulating, usually with an electrode, it's usually a lot more intense than the indirect stimulation that you get from actually doing the drugs or doing the other things that are enjoyable. So you can end up with much more extreme versions of this. And there are some very interesting studies, again, especially in rats, looking at just how intense and just how far these rats will go to maintain stimulation of these pathways. And there's a couple where they looked at the fact that rats would stop doing things like eating and drinking and would just do whatever would get this part of their brain stimulated. So it kind of shows the intensity of this reward circuitry. And so if we want to talk a little bit more about that synaptic plasticity and how that affects addiction, we can look at the fact that we know that our brain can change over time. So especially as we get older, we see differences in connections between neurons. We tend to see a lot less of sort of spontaneous production of new neurons, but what we do see are increases in connectivity, especially in areas that are activated more often. So with addiction, after we've moved past just that reward driven stage of it, once we've developed a habit, once we have this pathway activated consistently within the brain, then we're going to start seeing functional and structural changes in the brain that have been caused by this continuous use. So we can start seeing extra connections between neurons, so extra firing potentially, so that we have this sort of new pathway that's specifically targeted to drug use. And this is where this mesocortical limbic dopamine system comes into play. So when we start looking at our mesolimbic and mesocortical, that's kind of all of them combined. If we just stick them all together and say the mesolimbic cortical pathway, it's all of these arrows involved. And so this is sort of giving us a little bit of insight into why so many different aspects of our brain end up tied up and involved with addiction. So this is all of those different projections still involving dopamine. Dopamine is our main driving force behind all of the addiction sort of circuitry, but it also shows that we have connections to things like our prefrontal cortex, our amygdala, our hippocampus, the nucleus accumbens, all of those end up activated by this pathway. And so if we think of some of the roles that each of these different areas of the brain play, so our prefrontal cortex is really good at making connections between things. Our hippocampus is involved in forming and retrieving memories. So if this dopamine reward system is then activating and making connections with these parts of the brain, then it's not just that we're getting sort of that rush of dopamine, but we're also having other factors that are related to this. So maybe we have memories of using drugs or places where drug use was common. So even if you've sort of dropped that sort of physical habit, you no longer take that drug, if that pathway has been established, if you have those associations, even if you don't have that physical need for it, you can still have sort of mental associations, so memories, making connections between other things. The amygdala even focuses in on our emotions. So we start integrating all of these different components of the brain, and it kind of shows why this can be so all consuming because it affects sort of higher processing areas, it affects sort of our basal emotional responses, it ties in with memories, it ties in with everything. So we end up with lots of those issues, and it's probably these lasting changes, this plasticity that persists long after drug use has ended, that leads to relapses in the future. So that physical craving for it isn't necessarily driven by withdrawal. It's now driven by other things that have been established and sort of a long-term change in our brain chemistry. So that helps us understand why this can be a problem years or even decades after someone has stopped using a particular substance. And if we're talking about this kind of synaptic plasticity, we've already kind of alluded to the existence of hypofrontality. We didn't really give it a name. And so if you understand sort of the roots of words, hypo and hyper are two that mean opposite things. Hypo meaning sort of an underexpression and hyper meaning an overexpression. So hypofrontality would be reduced activity in those frontal regions of our brain. So people who have used drugs for long periods of time can end up with reduced activity in the areas of the brain associated with our working memory, our inhibition, and how we interact with and respond to our environment. So those prefrontal cortex areas that do that integration, that help us inhibit bad decisions and consider consequences of actions, so that would be one of those driving factors that can influence long-term drug users. And this is again tied into that idea that cravings can persist even years after you've started abstaining from a drug because of all of these structural changes, because of the extra stuff that's going on. And this hypofrontality is actually pretty intensive because, again, it's almost like it's set up to make it easier to go back to using the substance because behavioral inhibition would be being able to withhold partaking in a substance that you should probably be avoiding, and things like that. Question? Yeah, yeah, we could call it that because it would be caused by sort of exposure to something, and it is in or interfering with your ability to function normally. So yeah, even though it isn't as sort of acute as we might think of usually, where it's something sort of specific and all at once causing damage, yeah, this would be prolonged. Mhm. It depends on what study you look at. There's a lot of sort of up and coming research yet again, so we're at that cutting edge where we're not sure. Some studies show that if your drug use wasn't too prolonged, you can have some recovery, but other studies with longer time exposures end up showing that not really. And even this is related to things like lowered IQ, lower cognitive functioning. It's presented as sort of this massive, significant drop, but when you look at it, it's a drop of either 4 or 6 IQ points across a couple of decades. But again, for once, our textbook does a really good job and points out these are all correlational studies, and they're only a very small subset of studies. In order to make sort of really hard, conclusive decisions, we need to see a lot more research, especially in a lot more areas, because again, we have very North American centric research, and specifically on drugs that are problematic to our cities of concern. So we're starting to see a lot of those kinds of studies looking at prolonged exposure to marijuana, which can also cause this in high doses. Um, but yeah, it's sort of one of those cutting edge. We're not quite sure long term, but it seems like if you have extensive enough use over a long enough period of time, it can be permanent. Yeah. So lots of things to consider there. Um, The next couple of slides are getting into different ways that we can try and treat drug addiction. So if we're having these long-term changes in our brain chemistry, if we're having these prolonged differences in our behavior, it's clearly something that we might want to try and combat. And there are a bunch of different strategies that we can use to try and do this. They have varying different success levels. Some of them are more beneficial than others. Some of them work for particular drugs, but not others. And some of them are a little bit more controversial than others, but we'll hit on some of the high points here. Um, Okay, and I just want to make sure I do have it on the next slide because I always do this thing where I have them on one slide as a summary and then I forget that I've explained them further later. So I will talk about all of those different treatment strategies on their own slides when they come up. But I will talk first about comorbidity because that's explained on this. And so you might already understand the concept of comorbidity, and this is when you have sort of different disorders or different traits that tend to co-occur. So in this case, addiction tends to also co-occur in combination with other disorders, things like mental or emotional personality disorders. And those comorbidities can end up complicating rehabilitation because now you're not just fighting against sort of the effects of drug addiction, you're also working against other personality disorders, other sort of different mindsets that might make it even harder to treat these things. So if an individual has an addiction, you have to worry about, okay, well, is this comorbid disorder something that was caused by the drug addiction, or is the disorder what caused the drug addiction itself? So we don't necessarily know the directionality on those things. And sometimes we just want to treat both to try and counteract them. But for our methods of treatment, we can look at our agonist treatments. So these are when you replace an addictive drug with another drug that has a similar effect. And so if we think of our agonists and antagonists in terms of sort of drugs acting on neurotransmitters, the agonists are the ones that behave as though they are neurotransmitters, they enhance them. So for an agonist treatment, if we use a different drug to sort of step into the role of an existing drug, it kind of lines up with our existing concept of agonists. So this would be something like methadone would be a good idea of this, where we have a synthetic opioid that can be used to treat opioid addiction. We can have lots of different options where we have sort of less harmful versions of drugs, whether it's that they are less damaging to the brain, whether they're less addictive themselves, or even if they're just a lot safer to be using. A lot of times, especially with certain kinds of drug addiction, the issue is that people are seeking out illegal drugs from places of ill repute. So there's no standards, there's no guarantee of quality. And so if we can switch over to synthetic or regulated versions of these different kinds of drugs, then we can at least ensure that they're not going to be faced with sort of impurities or varying levels of concentration, which can all cause things like overdoses or other sort of problems depending on what's introduced into your system. So that can be beneficial. The downsides, of course, being that, well, you're not really getting rid of that addiction, you're just changing it from one thing to another. So some people don't like that as a long-term viable solution. We could go with the other direction and use an antagonist treatment. So these would act sort of against those addictive drugs. So these are drugs that block the functionality of an addictive drug. So maybe they're going to prevent that drug from binding to different receptors in the brain. So a great example of this would be um, Naxalone, no, naloxone. So the nasal spray that you can use if somebody's having an overdose. Um, Again, anything with like X's just really throwing me off today. But so if somebody's having an overdose, you can spray this particular drug into their nose. It'll affect the receptors into their brain and it'll prevent that drug from actually taking full effect. Again, downsides here are that if you are blocking these receptors, that individual can go from having sort of a lot of responding to a drug to no responding at all if you've given them a sufficient dose to sort of turn off all the receptors. And they can end up going through withdrawal if it's severe enough. So it's again kind of a balance of, is it safer to give them this sort of counteractive agent, or should we sort of ease them onto it? But it's going to depend on dosages and their experience with stuff and all of that. But it is one option that can help. In terms of long-term treatment, antagonist treatments are really difficult because you're then relying on someone who is addicted to substances to take something that negates the effect of the substance that they're used to taking. So outside of clinical settings, outside of, say, a hospital or a rehab center, it might be very difficult to get them to continue taking this kind of a treatment. So not necessarily a good long-term solution. We can look at aversive treatments, which brings me back into my comfort zone, which is learning. So we talked about the fact that when we establish addiction, we start off with that reward system. We start off with positive reinforcement where something that makes you feel good, you're going to do it more often. This basically takes the opposite stance. This goes with um, positive punishment is the correct term, where you're introducing a stimulus that makes you feel bad. So you introduce something bad. So maybe you have a drug that reacts with the drug that they are addicted to. There are some really good ones that work with, say, alcohol. So whenever someone drinks alcohol, they have a drug in their system that binds to those molecules. It prevents it from breaking down and metabolizing normally, and as a side effect, makes them feel really sick. So with enough time, they learn an association between drinking alcohol and then feeling sick. And if it's going to be causing something bad every single time, they learn a new association that they're going to avoid drinking alcohol so that they avoid feeling sick all the time. Again, we have this issue where we depend on an addict's willingness to make themselves uncomfortable in order to quit. They would have to continue taking this aversive treatment in order to keep getting the benefit from it, which again doesn't necessarily happen outside of controlled settings. The one that I found the coolest was anti-drug vaccines. And so this is more of a long-term treatment, and these are molecules that are specifically designed to attach to the drug and stimulate our immune system in order to make antibodies that degrade the drug. So we basically use a standard vaccine approach to tell our body that these drug molecules are bad and should be removed from our system. And so if our body immediately attacks and degrades all of these drug molecules, they don't have as much of a chance to bind to receptors and act on our brain the way that they want to. So this can be sort of a long-term thing. This is more new tech, this is something that's more recently come out, but it can last a couple of weeks up to a couple of years, depending on the situation. So this is one of those that in the future might start being a little bit more appealing. And apparently I put comorbidity again here, but we already talked about that, so we're just going to continue onward. But the next thing we're going to do is talk about the role of genes in addiction. And this is another one of those fun topics that I find fairly interesting just because I've taught an entire class on how genes affect our behavior. And there's a lot of discussion about addiction and sort of that predisposition towards addiction as being something behavioral that can have a genetic component. So that's the part that we're going to talk about here. And of course, alcoholism is one of those big problems that's been around for long enough that people have been studying it for centuries at this point. So we mentioned that we have records of people drinking alcohol for centuries. So problems with alcohol addiction, they've been around for quite a long time. And some of the earliest studies would have come around long before we had the ability to look at the genome at the level of individual genes. This would have been established by looking at, say, family studies, where we were investigating heritability of these traits. And at first, it was really difficult to find a relationship. We weren't really getting fantastic results. It wasn't until people realized there are actually two types of alcoholism. The first type of alcoholism are people who tend to be very cautious and emotionally dependent on others, and they typically have an onset of this alcoholism after the age of 25 or so. And the pattern of drinking with these individuals is that they'll abstain for long periods of time, then they'll drink very, very heavily, and then they'll feel guilty and they'll abstain again for long periods of time. The other type of alcoholics, type 2, are people who are impulsive, really bad with inhibition, they are confident, and they drink socially. And these individuals tend to start drinking much, much younger. They drink frequently, and they very rarely go through those periods of abstinence. And so these are two very different approaches to alcoholism. And we actually found that each of these have sort of different ways of being inherited. So if we consider, we've talked about the fact that we can look at, say, environmental versus genetic components. So if we look at individuals who are raised with their biological parents versus adoptive parents, we can look at twin studies and all of that stuff to pick apart how much is a genetic component and how much is an environmental component. And people have done all of these kinds of studies on alcoholism, and they found that that type 1 alcoholic, they're only at risk of developing alcoholism if their environment includes risks of exposure to alcohol. So if one of their parents is an alcoholic, then they are likely to later in life develop alcoholism themselves. And they tend to follow the same pattern that their parents did. So that seems to be an environmental influence. And there's very little genetic component to that type of alcoholism. Type 2 alcoholism, on the other hand, that one seems to be genetically driven, where whether the individuals have environmental exposure to alcohol or not, whether their parent or adoptive parent is alcoholic, we're still going to see that behavior passed on genetically. So biological relatives, so individuals with type 2 alcoholism, their biological relatives are also more likely to have that type 2 alcoholism, but we don't see that genetic relation with type 1 alcoholism. So that was our breakthrough when we finally figured out that, okay, the reason we were having so much trouble tracking alcoholism is because there are two distinctive ways of being an alcoholic, and they could be driven by different factors. So if we wanted to look at ways that genes might influence our predisposition to addiction, we might look at things that influence maybe how drugs are metabolized. Maybe we are looking at drugs that affect our neurotransmitter levels or how many receptors we have for those neurotransmitters. So more production of neurotransmitter would mean more signal, but also more receptors for neurotransmitters would mean that you get more signal, more responding, um, even with the same amount of neurotransmitter produced. So either of those can cause an increase. And we have all sorts of other additional risk factors. But if we think of the fact that our genes are producing proteins that go out into the body and do things, then we can think of genes that have anything to do with anything along the pathway of interacting with drugs, whether it's the metabolism of drugs, the binding to of drugs, any of that, or receptors that receive those drugs, that can all be an influence. And this is kind of why it's so complicated to start looking for specific genes that might be related to a particular type of addiction. So when we're looking at our alcoholism, because again, that's one of the ones that's been most widely studied, we can have different driving factors depending on which family you're in. So we've talked about sort of the type 1 and type 2 alcoholism. Those aren't the be all and end all categories. There are also different sort of subtypes. Then there's some overlap between the two. That's just sort of our simplified version to help illustrate a point. But we can also have sort of this interaction between different genes and different activities. I don't know of any specifically to do with alcoholism and drugs, but I do know that with things like predisposition to mental illness, there are, say, different families will have different mutations that affect sort of different parts of the same pathway. So if we were looking at something that's affecting our dopamine reward pathway, so maybe something affects the production of dopamine, and maybe something affects the production of dopamine receptors, and maybe something affects the reuptake of dopamine. And all of those can affect the same pathway, but they do it in different ways. So we kind of have to quantify sort of which aspect is being influenced by which genes, and that can take quite a bit of work. We also want to consider that drugs can also impact genetic function. So it's not just a one-way street. It's not just that our genes influence how we interact with drugs. Drugs can influence the production or the expression of different genes. So most of the time this will be done through methylation, and that's just the attachment of an extra methyl group to the DNA. And that makes it impossible for all of our mechanisms to attach to make copies of that gene in order to send it off to turn it into a protein. So drugs could prevent us from expressing different genes, which can be problematic in and of itself. But these are sort of a bunch of different ways that we could frame this, a bunch of different ways that we can consider this. And as I said, there are so many other aspects we could talk about with this. We could do an entire course just on the genetic aspect of it. But yeah, keep in mind that when we're looking at a lot of these studies and when you see scores of the heritability of a particular drug, keep in mind that it's not always an absolute. So even somebody who has a predisposition towards alcoholism, maybe they have family members with that type 2 alcoholism. It doesn't necessarily mean that as soon as they're exposed to alcohol, they're immediately going to become an alcoholic. When we talk about sort of the gene and environment influences, we're usually looking at something like maybe 50% or less heredity. So we tend to see much lower scores involving genetics and much higher scores involving environment. So just don't get too I guess, tied into some of the mathematics. I know that some of our textbooks get a little bit dramatic about there being sort of genetic influences, and sometimes, not so much in our text, but I've seen other ones that talk about genes causing different disorders or addictions or things like that, which is definitely an interesting stance to take that I definitely would not stand behind. All right. And so for our big in perspective wrap up at the end here, um, we talked a lot about it. We didn't talk too much about the physical costs of drug abuse, but from the discussion of sort of how involved this can get in all aspects of our lives, and especially when we start looking at the scale of some of these disorders and different kinds of drugs that can be abused, and not even just illegal drugs, but things like alcohol and even now marijuana, things that are legal to get access to, we still have a lot of immense costs. So we have to consider that human aspect. So if individuals become addicted to substances, it can become very difficult to sort of disconnect from those substances. We can end up with loss of health, differences in our brain functionality, differences in how we behave and act that can influence our productivity and how we're living our lives. We can also look at the financial cost, where dealing with drug abuse, whether it's legal or illegal, can cause issues in healthcare systems. It can cause issues with trying to sort of enforce not having illegal drugs around. So, treatment and incarceration can be very expensive as well. So, it'll be interesting to see how future studies looking at these pathways that are involved and the most effective ways to counteract addiction, if that might help us start alleviating some of these issues and getting to the root cause instead of just treating the after effects. So, an interesting and constantly evolving field, and also, I'd like to see how it progresses in the next couple of years. But yeah, we'll leave it there for this chapter. We are quite short today, but I suppose you won't mind. Um, we'll start chapter 6 on Monday, and as I said, we should finish chapter 6 next week and then be back on track with our syllabus outline.